Alright guys, so today we're starting topic 2, exercise physiology, and we'll be looking at the structure and the function of the ventilatory system. So this is your lungs. It's how we get air from the atmosphere into our lungs and pass that oxygen through to our blood so it can go to our working muscles and everywhere that it's needed. The ventilatory system's also sometimes called the pulmonary system, so keep an eye out if you ever see that word pulmonary. It refers to lungs as well, and it can also be called the respiratory system as well, so it's got 3 different names. Alright, so to start with this topic, we're going to go over some of the key structures of the ventilatory system. So they're highlighted here for you. Firstly, we'll start with the nose. It's where air enters in, also through the mouth. But for the most part, we're breathing through our nose, like when we're sleeping. Obviously, if we're exercising more, we're going to breathe through our mouth to get more volume of oxygen and air into the lungs. As that air passes through the nose, it comes down to the pharynx, which is the back of the throat. This is where your tonsils are kept. So air comes in through the nose, there's mucus, and the lining of the nose helps to warm and moisten the air. Same thing is happening in the pharynx. That air is getting warm and moist as it travels down to the larynx. Now, the larynx is an important structure because it helps to separate air from food. So when you swallow food, we want it to go down into our stomach, not down into our lungs. So at the larynx, there's actually a little flap, and it's called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis opens and closes to correctly direct food versus air into the correct space. So the larynx helps to direct the air into the lungs. The air then continues down the trachea, which is like a cylinder-shaped cartilage structure. Through the trachea, at the base of the trachea, it branches off into 2 bronchi. So you can see the left main bronchus and the right main bronchus, the plural for that being bronchi. And think of the bronchi like the base of a tree. So the bronchi are then going to break off and form all these little bronchioles. So all of these little tiny pathways for the air to flow through the lungs until it reaches what's called the terminal bronchiole, where the alveoli lie. And the alveoli are those little sacs that the air goes into where the gas exchange occurs. So the blood is going to pick up the oxygen at the alveoli, and the blood will also get rid of carbon dioxide and other waste products at the alveoli for us to breathe out. So when we breathe in, the oxygen makes its way down the pharynx, larynx, through the trachea, through the bronchi, to the end of the bronchioles where it reaches the alveoli, and then it diffuses into the blood. In the other way around, the blood carrying carbon dioxide and the waste products gives that to the alveoli, which then makes its way back up the ventilatory system to be breathed out. Another important structure is the diaphragm. The diaphragm, it's a muscle that lies just underneath the lungs, which contracts and relaxes in order to expand and get air into the lungs, and then it also helps to make the lungs smaller and push the air back out. So the diaphragm, it's a very important muscle for breathing. The diaphragm is also an interesting muscle because it's both voluntary and involuntary. So when you're sleeping, you're not actively thinking about contracting your diaphragm to breathe. It's just happening naturally. It's happening involuntarily, just as your heart is beating involuntarily. But you can also contract your diaphragm voluntarily as well. If you were to take a deep breath in, that's you contracting your diaphragm by your decision. So it has both voluntary and involuntary properties. So you need to know some descriptions and functions of each of these different structures, and they're written here for you. For the most part, in the upper ventilatory system, the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, we're trying to moisten and warm that incoming air. We're providing the passageway for air. The pharynx and the larynx is also important because it helps to distinguish between air and food. At the lungs, we're composed of all the little bronchioles and the alveoli, which is where the gas exchange is going to take place, and it's made of this elastic connective tissue. So your lungs are super stretchy, but something to remember as well is that they're also wet. Your lungs are a wet, sort of sticky structure, and that's going to be important later on. So remember that the lungs are a wet structure. That's why we want the air coming into it to be warm and moist. The bronchi and bronchioles are our tree branches that go out into our lungs that help bring the air to the alveoli for the gas exchange. And then we've got the diaphragm, which is that dome-shaped muscle at the base of the lungs, which aids in breathing. And you'd all be familiar with the diaphragm when you have hiccups. The hiccups is just a spasm of your diaphragm muscle. All right, so a few different functions of the conducting airways. The main function is that it warms and moistens the air so that it enters the lungs in a wet state. It provides a low resistance pathway for airflow, so it's funneled in through the pharynx, the larynx, down the trachea, and it also helps to protect the trachea as well with that epiglottis that's in the larynx. It prevents food and water that we drink from entering the lungs. Now, there's quite a few different volumes and capacities that we need to know when it comes to the pulmonary system. So firstly, pulmonary ventilation. It's basically just a really fancy way of saying breathing. It's the inflow and the outflow of air between the atmosphere and the lungs. That's pulmonary ventilation. Tidal volume is the volume that we breathe in and out in one breath. So it's just our normal breathing rate, how much air comes in, how much air comes out. Expiratory reserve volume is if I take a normal breath out and then I breathe out some more, that's my expiratory reserve volume. It's the maximum amount of air that I can actually breathe out of my lungs. Now, what's interesting to note is that you can never breathe all of the air out of your lungs. There'll always be some air left in your lungs, and this is called the residual volume. It's the air that's still contained in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. It's really important that some air, that this residual volume remains within the lungs. If all of that air leaves the lungs, say you have a bad accident and you puncture a lung and all the air flows out, what happens is that sticky, wet structure of the lungs just comes in and sort of collapses into itself. And this is what a collapsed lung is. So if you ever know anyone who's had a collapsed lung, maybe they've been in a car accident and broken a rib, and that rib has stuck into the lung, and then all the air flows out and the lung collapses. Now, it's not a death sentence. If you collapse one lung, then you can still breathe through the other fairly fine, but it is a serious condition. Inspiratory reserve volume is the same, except it's when you take a breath in. So say I take a normal breath in and then I breathe in even more. That's my inspiratory reserve volume. So it's the total amount of air that I can breathe in. It's like a maximal breath in. Now, vital capacity is the maximum of volume of air that can be exhaled and inhaled. So it equals our tidal volume plus our inspiratory reserve volume and expiratory reserve volume. It's basically the amount of air that I can use. It's all of the air that I can breathe in and out. Now remember that residual volume, I can't breathe that out. So that's not included in vital capacity because it's not a bit of air that I can use. It's always going to stay in there. Versus the total lung capacity, which is the amount of the total amount of air. It's the vital capacity plus the plus the residual volume. So it's all of the air in my lungs after I take a massive breath in. If I breathe in as much as I can, that's going to be my total lung capacity because my residual volume's in there and my vital capacity is in there. So just remember, you can't use all of your total lung capacity because that would mean that you would have a collapsed lung. Now, this is a very important graph for you guys to understand. It does come up in the exams a lot. So let's have a look at how we're going to read this. We've got the volume of air on the y-axis and time along the x-axis. So if we start at the very beginning, we've got these small little waves, breathing in, breathing out. That's our tidal volume. So he's got these small little waves, and then he takes a really big breath in, reaching the inspiratory reserve volume, getting to his max inspiratory level. Then we take a huge breath out, we empty out all of the air that we possibly can from our lungs, and we reach the expiratory reserve volume. Now remember, we can't dip into that residual volume at the bottom, so that stays there no matter what. Then we go back to normal breathing for a couple breaths, big breath in, normal breathing, and so on. So if I want to see what vital capacity is on this graph, it would look like this. It's my inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes plus the tidal volume. So that's my vital capacity. It's everything that I can use. Versus the total lung capacity, which is everything I can use plus the residual volume. Now during exercise, what do you think happens to a graph like this? What do you think happens to the tidal volume, just the amount of volume of air that's coming in and out of our lungs? It's probably going to increase, right? As we're breathing deeper, that tidal volume tends to increase. And then what happens to the inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes? They end up decreasing. So we end up having a graph that might look like this. So our tidal volume increases and the reserve volumes decrease for our inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes. That residual volume always remaining the same. Now, there's a few muscles that you also need to know when we talk about ventilation and breathing. There's two main respiratory muscles. It's the diaphragm, which we said lies underneath our lungs. It's the dome-shaped muscle. And there's also the intercostal muscles. Now, whenever you see that term costal, always think ribs. That term costal normally means ribs. So intercostal muscles means in between rib muscles. And it's mainly the external intercostals which help us with breathing. So these are two very important muscles to refer to when we're talking about breathing. And if we're taking really deep breaths, let's say we're exercising and we're inhaling and exhaling a lot more than we normally would, there are also other muscles which are going to help us. For example, the abs are going to help us to really exhale the air. If we squeeze our abs, we can help to contract those lungs and push the air out a little bit more. There's also some muscles in the neck as well. If you've ever seen someone who's just finished exercising really hard and all of the muscles on their neck are sort of sticking out, that's because those muscles on the neck can help to get more air into the lungs. It's mainly the sternocleidomastoid muscle in the neck which helps with breathing. So let's see what actually happens with these muscles when we take a breath in. So this is inspiration. So on inspiration, the two important muscles for ventilation contract. So the diaphragm contracts and the intercostals contract. Now, when the diaphragm contracts, it actually moves downwards. It moves inferiorly to help widen and expand that lung volume. The intercostals also contract, which helps to flare and raise the rib cage. So when you take a deep breath in, you can feel your rib cage gets wider, but it also rises as well. So that's from those intercostal muscles. So in this position, once you've taken a breath in, your lungs are being stretched. So the volume within the lungs is being increased. So pulmonary volume increases. When the volume of the lungs increases, it means the pressure inside the actual lungs drops. So we're increasing the size of the lungs, making the pressure within there drop. Now the pressure is going to drop below the pressure of the actual atmosphere. And what that means is that the high air pressure in the atmosphere is going to come running into the lungs to sort of equalize with the low air pressure that I've just created in the lungs. So that's how air comes in. So when you're not thinking about breathing, for example, when you're sleeping, this is what makes you breathe. It's this discrepancy between high and low air pressure that keeps air coming in and out, because air pressure always wants to equalize. So we're creating a low pressure in the lungs, which is making the air flow in from the atmosphere, and the air will continue to flow into the lungs until the pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure, and then it will naturally stop flowing in. And what happens on expiration is the same but opposite. So the diaphragm relaxes, it lifts upwards, it moves superiorly, and the intercostal muscles relax, and the rib cage sort of descends back to its normal position. The lungs recoil, they become smaller, so the volume of the lungs decreases, and that increases the pressure within the lungs. So air flows out of the lungs until the pressure again is equal to the atmosphere. So remember, high pressure air always wants to go to where the low pressure is. So by reducing the volume of the lungs, we're creating a high pressure within the lungs so that air will flow back out into the atmosphere. And that's how breathing takes place without you thinking about it, without you needing ATP or energy to do it. So it's all about this relationship between volume and pressure. When we increase the volume, the pressure lowers, the air flows in. When we reduce the volume of the lungs, the pressure rises and the air flows out. Now, in our brain, we have the respiratory control center, and this is at the medulla oblongata in the brain. It's pretty much the brainstem, right at the base of the brain there. And this is going to be how the brain, or how we actually regulate breathing day to day and also during exercise. So, in the medulla oblongata, information is processed and sent back down to the body for that decision to be made, whether we need to breathe harder, breathe less, breathe deeper. So all over the body, we have these receptors which are controlled by our central nervous system, our brain, and so on. And these receptors, they detect changes in the body and they report this information back to the respiratory control center, the medulla oblongata, to make these decisions. So we've got 3 key receptors in the body which help to give information to the brain to tell me how to breathe, basically. We've got chemoreceptors. So chemo, that prefix, they're going to focus on chemicals. They're going to detect changes in chemicals within the blood. We've got proprioceptors, which are going to detect changes in movement, and we've got lung stretch receptors, which detect stretch within the lungs. And all of these receptors are going to help us regulate and control our breathing. So let's talk about each of these separately. So firstly, the chemoreceptors, they're picking up on the carbon dioxide in the blood. So when I have increased carbon dioxide in the blood, when the blood acidity levels rise, and remember this equals a low pH. So when I have high blood acidity because of all of the carbon dioxide in my blood, my brain is going to increase the rate and depth of ventilation to help expel that carbon dioxide and get that oxygen in. If I don't have very much carbon dioxide in the blood and my blood acidity levels are normal, I'm not going to have a very high or deep rate of breathing. I'm going to have a decrease in my rate and depth of ventilation. So when we exercise produces that carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which is going to increase the blood acidity levels. The chemoreceptors are picking up on those blood acidity levels, sending that message back to the brain, and the brain is going to tell me I need to breathe harder and faster. The proprioceptors are quite simple. They detect movement. So the more I move my body around, the more I'm going to breathe, the deeper and faster I'm going to breathe. So if I'm running and I start moving my body a lot, if I'm dancing around, I'm going to have a greater pulmonary ventilation rate and depth. When I'm not moving, let's say I'm lying down, I'm not going to be breathing so fast because I'm not doing anything. The proprioceptors are saying, okay, we're just relaxing now. We don't need to breathe very hard. And then finally, we have the stretch receptors. Now, these don't have anything to do with muscle stretch. They've got to do with the stretch of the lungs. So it comes into play, let's say when we have a massive influx of oxygen, right? I'm taking a breath in. Now, if I'm taking a breath in, my body needs the oxygen, but I can't just keep breathing in, right? If I keep breathing in, that can't go forever. The lungs can't just keep expanding and expanding. Let's say I didn't have any ribs or anything. If the lungs just kept expanding, eventually they'd pop. So I need to know when I need to relax those lungs, when I need to stop breathing in. And those lung stretch receptors are what tell my brain that, okay, my lungs full enough of oxygen now, let's relax and exhale. So they stop the lung from intaking oxygen and air when it's at its absolute maximum, when it's full. It inhibits inspiration, so it stops me from breathing in, and it stimulates the expiration. It begins the breathing out process to prevent the overstretching of the lungs, and it's called the Herring-Brewer reflex. Okay, so let's look at gas exchange now. We know that gas exchange takes place at the alveoli, at the very final part of the lungs where the oxygen reaches, and then it is transferred into blood. How is that oxygen transferred into the blood? And how is the carbon dioxide in my blood transferred back into the lungs to be breathed out? So it's this relationship, this changeover of oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have about 700 million alveoli, which makes up about 75 square meters of surface area for this gas exchange to take place. So important to remember that the alveoli are all covered in these capillaries, these tiny little blood vessels, and oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the capillaries, and carbon dioxide goes the other way around. If there wasn't the capillaries there, the oxygen would have nowhere to go. It wouldn't be able to get into our blood. So the link between the alveoli and the blood capillary and the capillaries is integral to this whole process. That's how we're going to get oxygen into our blood and to our muscles. Now, how does actually oxygen cross this pathway? How does it go from the alveoli into the capillaries? That's what we're going to have a look at next. And that's all to do with partial pressure. Now, partial pressure is just like the amount of gas that's within a sort of mixture of gases. So when we breathe in air from the atmosphere, that's not all just oxygen. It's actually only about 21% oxygen, and it's made up of other gases. So partial pressure is how much of a certain gas is within that mixture of gases. So for movement to occur, for diffusion to take place, there's a gradient. There's got to be a gradient in this partial pressure. And just like air moves from high pressure to low pressure, gases also move from high concentration to low concentration. And this partial pressure is always measured in millimeters of mercury. So when you see mmHg, that's just referring to millimeters of mercury. That's just the unit it's diffused. That's the unit that it's measured in. So here we go. We've got the alveoli in blue and the blood capillary there in red. Oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the blood. Carbon dioxide is going to come from the blood into the alveoli to be breathed out. So how does that occur? Now, in the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is high, about 103 millimeters of mercury, versus in the blood, the partial pressure of oxygen is low. It's about 40 millimeters of mercury. Therefore, the oxygen will diffuse into the capillaries. It will just pass through that barrier and go into the blood. It happens the other way around for carbon dioxide as well. So carbon dioxide, partial pressure in the capillaries is high versus in the alveoli is low. Remember, high always moves to low to try and equalize that gradient. Therefore, carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveoli for it to be expelled when we exhale. Now we're going to talk about quickly how oxygen is actually transported within the blood, and it's transported within our red blood cells, particularly by a molecule called hemoglobin. It's 98% of the oxygen in the blood is transported by these hemoglobin molecules. So I believe in the body there's about 25 trillion red blood cells, and each one of these red blood cells can carry about 250 million hemoglobin. So we've got heaps of it. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen as well. Now, when the oxygen enters the blood, it attaches on the hemoglobin at the Heme group, so HEME group, and this is just another word for iron. So there's some iron in this hemoglobin that's important because it's going to carry that oxygen as it floats around on the red blood cell. So oxygen comes in, it attaches to the Heme group of the hemoglobin, which is found within the red blood cells to be transported around the body. Now, if we think about some blood doping and different bad things that you're not supposed to do when it comes to improving exercise, you guys have all probably heard of blood doping before. It's when you take out some of your blood. So it's just like when you go to the doctor to donate blood, you do the same thing to yourself. You take out a whole heap of your blood, you put it in the freezer, and you wait, because your body will regenerate those blood cells that you've lost over a little bit of time. So you let your body regenerate the blood cells that you've lost until you're back at normal. Then you take your blood back out of the freezer, you let it defrost, and then you put it back into yourself. All of a sudden there, you've increased the amount of blood that you're carrying, you've increased the amount of red blood cells that you have, and you've increased the amount of hemoglobin that you have as well. So your blood is able to carry a lot more oxygen than it normally would be able to. This is actually the same process that occurs when you do training at altitude. When you train at altitude, you increase the amount of red blood cells within your body, and therefore have greater capacity for endurance exercise as well. So that's a natural process which occurs when you're at altitude. In terms of blood doping, you just do it to like the extreme level, and it's banned from all sports where you get tested. It's banned. EPO is another interesting one as well. EPO is a hormone called erythropoietin, which you inject into yourself. So it's like taking a steroid, basically. You inject the hormone into yourself, and that hormone tells your body to produce more red blood cells. So it's essentially doing the same thing, blood doping and EPO, just through two different ways. Blood doping, you're just putting more of your own blood back into yourself. EPO, you're using a hormone to tell your body to create more red blood cells. So the more red blood cells you have, the better able you are to carry oxygen from your lungs to your working muscles. And this is going to increase that endurance, that measure of endurance, which you all know called VO2 max. So VO2 max being the volume of oxygen that your body can utilize. So by having more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, we're able to use more oxygen and give that to our working muscles to create more energy. So this all is to increase our VO2 max.